Sailors called this system hope and pray. After the deafening roar of depth charges, its quiet hiss seemed like a pathetic mockery. A miss didn't mean a loud bang, but a humiliating, dead silence. But they didn't know yet that it was this silence that would become the most terrifying sound for German submariners. The sound that preceded not a miss, but a cold-blooded, merciless execution. This is the story of how a weapon born of desperation taught sailors to kill silently. We will show how failures, fury, and brilliant tactics transformed an object of ridicule into a surgical instrument that allowed a single destroyer to destroy 6 submarines in just 12 days. May 1943. This month would forever enter the annals of the Kriegsmarine under one name: Black May. It wasn't just a series of defeats. It was a collapse. The backbone of Germany's submarine fleet, which had held the Atlantic in its grip for 3.5 years, was broken. Broken quickly, brutally, and decisively. Victory came not from a single factor, but from a perfect storm of 3 technological and tactical breakthroughs that converged at a single point in time and space. The first horseman of the apocalypse for the Wolfpacks was centimetric radar. Installed on planes and ships, it saw what had been invisible before. It could even see the tiny conning tower of a surfaced submarine. At night, in the fog, in a storm. German radar detectors, tuned to the old, longer wavelengths, remained silent. Submariners surfaced, confident in their safety, only to have a Liberator bomber dive on them from the clouds minutes later. The second horseman was long-range aviation. The Allies had finally closed the black hole, a gap in the mid-Atlantic that their planes previously couldn't reach. Now, the skies above the convoys were patrolled around the clock. Submarines could no longer operate with impunity on the surface, even during the day. The ocean became transparent from top to bottom, but it was the third horseman that delivered the killing blow. It was the Hedgehog, and not just any Hedgehog, but its new, improved version, the Mark 11. Engineers had equipped it with gyroscopic stabilization. Now, the ship's roll no longer affected its accuracy. In a roaring storm, as the deck heaved and swayed, the mount remained stationary relative to the horizon. Its accuracy increased exponentially. Hope and prey gave way to cold calculation. Imagine Admiral Dönitz's headquarters in Berlin, a huge map of the Atlantic. Every day, adjutants with grim faces approach it and remove the small flags. 1, 2, 5. In the first 3 weeks of May, the Kriegsmarine lost 34 submarines, a third of its entire active fleet in the Atlantic. The best crews, experienced commanders, and aces were lost. It was a slaughter. The reports landing on Dönitz's desk painted a terrifying picture. U-210, attacked by the destroyer Fame, a Hedgehog salvo, 1 explosion, destroyed. U-95, detected by Captain Walker's sloop, Starling, creeping tactic, Hedgehog salvo, destroyed. U-752, cornered by the frigate Tavy, Hedgehog salvo, destroyed. The name of this weapon appeared in reports again and again, like a funeral knell. German submariners, accustomed to being hunters, suddenly realized they had become the prey. The ocean was teeming with enemy hunter-killer groups. The sky above constantly droned with the engines of aircraft. The attacks became sudden, precise, and absolutely lethal. On May 24th, Karl Dönitz, the man who had promised to bring Britain to its knees, was forced to admit defeat. He issued an order that would have seemed unthinkable just a month earlier: to temporarily cease operations in the North Atlantic, to withdraw the surviving Wolfpacks to safer waters. On that day, the Battle of the Atlantic was won. There was no euphoria on the bridges of Allied ships. There was only a grim exhaustion and a quiet realization. We did it. We broke their back. They're running. The path to Europe for our armies, for the millions of soldiers and tons of equipment that will decide the outcome of the war, is now open. We are no longer the victims. From now on, we are the masters of this ocean. And the Atlantic, once their battlefield, had become a graveyard for German submariners. The Hedgehog's most terrifying weapon wasn't the 16 kilograms of explosives in each bomb. It wasn't even its accuracy. Its most terrifying weapon was the silence it created. This silence attacked not the submarine's sturdy hull, but the minds of its crew. It waged its own, separate war, a war of nerves. To understand this horror, you have to be inside a German U-boat during an attack. The year is 1944. Submarine U-552 is lying at a depth of 100 meters. The compartments smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and fear. The dim emergency lights are on. The only connection to the outside world is the sonar operator, a young man named Kurt, who is now gripping his headphones so tightly his knuckles have turned white. He can hear them. Ping. Ping. A destroyer is somewhere above. It's circling like a shark. Before, with depth charges, everything was straightforward. After the destroyer passed over them, hell would break loose. A series of deafening explosions would shake the boat, extinguish the lights, and throw men against the bulkheads. It was terrifying, but it provided information. From the force of the explosions, the commander could determine how far away the enemy was, where he needed to move. The roar was a map of the battle. But now, everything had changed. Kurt suddenly hears a short, barely perceptible hissing sound. And that's it. Silence. He looks at his commander, Captain Lieutenant Eric Topp. The commander looks back at him. The entire crew, 20, 30, 40 men, are frozen in their compartments, having become nothing but ears. Their gazes are fixed on the bulkheads, on the ceiling, as if trying to see through the steel to what is happening outside. A second passes. 2. 5. Silence. 10. Silence. What does it mean? Did they miss? Are we safe? Or are the projectiles already flying towards us? Perhaps in a moment, that single, final explosion will come. This silence lasts for minutes that feel like an eternity. The heart pounds in the chest like a jackhammer. Every creak of the hull, every rustle, seems like a harbinger of death. The uncertainty is maddening. Aboard the Allied destroyer, the sonar operator calmly reports to his captain, "Another miss, sir." The captain nods. "All right, reload. We'll go again." There isn't a hint of doubt in his voice. He knows that time is on his side. Let them get nervous down there. Let them sit in their steel can and think about what awaits them. They don't have a moment's peace. They know we're here. We're not going anywhere. We'll just do it again. Over and over. For Kurt and his comrades, this was a sophisticated form of torture. Before, the explosions were the enemy's fury. Now, the silence was its contempt. It told them, "You're not even worth wasting explosives on. We'll kill you with a single precise strike, whenever we feel like it." Submarine veterans who survived that slaughter would later say that the roar of depth charges hardened you, but the silence of the Hedgehog, it broke you. It destroyed morale from within. It turned bold hunters into cornered animals, cowering in a dark burrow, waiting for a deadly, merciless stick to be poked inside. This psychology of silence became the final nail in the coffin of Germany's submarine fleet. They lost the war not when their boats began to sink by the dozens, but when silence became more terrifying to them than any explosion. By the spring of 1944, The war had shifted to the other side of the world, the Pacific Ocean. Here, the enemy wasn't the German Wolfpacks, but the tenacious and fanatical crews of Japanese submarines. And it was here, in the boundless blue expanse, that the story of the Hedgehog reached its apogee. It became a legend. The name of this legend was the destroyer escort USS England. It was an unremarkable ship, one of hundreds of such workhorses that had rolled off American slipways. The crew consisted of former farmers, mechanics, and students, turned into sailors by the will of war. But they had something more. They had experience, perfect coordination, and absolute faith in their weapon. They had transformed submarine hunting from an art into a science. May 1944. The England receives orders to join a hunter-killer group. Intelligence reported that the Japanese had deployed a line of submarine pickets in the path of the American fleet. The mission: clear the area. On May 19th, the England's radar picks up a faint contact. A few minutes later, the sonar operator confirms, submarine. The hunt begins. But it lacks the fury and desperation of the war's early years. There are no chaotic attacks. Everything happens with cold, methodical precision. The atmosphere on the England's bridge is almost academic. The commander, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, gives short, clear commands. The sonar operator, hunched over his instrument, monotonously dictates the bearing and distance figures. The Hedgehog crew on the bow acts as a single mechanism, not a single wasted movement. No panic. Contact. Closing in. Fire. A short hiss. A brief moment of silence. And then, a deep, guttural explosion from the depths. The sonar operator looks up. Got it. Target destroyed. The commander nods. Good. Next. That was the Japanese submarine I-16, the first, but it was only the beginning. 3 days later, on May 22nd, the England hunts down and sinks the submarine Row 106. The next day, May 23rd, Row 104. The day after that, May 24th, Row 116. On May 26th, after a short respite, Row 108. The hunt became routine, a grim, deadly, but routine. For the crew of the England, they were no longer elusive phantoms of the deep. They were just targets on a map, dots on a sonar screen, one after another. They had turned war into an equation that always had the same solution. The climax came on May 31st. The England detected its 6th victim in 12 days, the submarine Row 105. After the very first Hedgehog salvo, a massive explosion erupted from the depths, nearly throwing the destroyer into the air. The Japanese submarine, likely carrying torpedoes, had detonated with monstrous force. Six submarines. In 12 days. One ship. It was an absolute eternal record in anti-submarine warfare, one that would never be broken. News of this feat spread throughout the entire U.S. Navy. The England transformed from a simple destroyer into the god of destruction, a symbol of complete and unconditional supremacy. Disarray reigned at the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 6 of their best submarines, an entire defensive line, destroyed in 2 weeks by a single ship. It was impossible. It defied all laws of war. The admirals couldn't comprehend who they were fighting, what weapon they had encountered. They didn't know they were fighting more than just a ship. They were fighting a perfect system honed to the absolute. They were fighting a cold, methodical mastery that had turned their elite submariners into helpless targets. The Allies had created the perfect submarine killer, and its name was England. War is not just a clash of armies, it is a clash of wills. And by the end of 1944, the will of the Axis's elite submarine forces was broken. They had encountered something more than just new technology. They saw in the Allies' actions a methodical, cold, and, as one captured officer wrote, fanatically calm extermination. Their fighting spirit, forged in years of triumph, crumbled to dust. We know this not from Allied reports. We know it from the last, desperate letters that German and Japanese officers wrote home, from diaries found in sunken submarines, from the interrogation transcripts of the few who were lucky enough to survive. Oberleutnant Klaus Schneider, commander of U-boat U-740, writes to his wife, Martha, from the occupied port of La Rochelle. It is his last letter. He doesn't describe battles. He doesn't boast of victories, because there are no more. He writes about his inner state, about the collapse of his faith. Martha, he writes, here, in the Bay of Biscay, I realized that we cannot defeat this country. And I'm not talking about America or Britain. I am talking about the system they have created. You can kill a soldier in a fair fight, but how do you kill a system that hunts you so relentlessly and so effectively? Our valor, our skill, to which we have dedicated our entire lives, has proven powerless against their mathematics. He describes how his boat was pursued for hours by a hunter-killer group, how they gave him no chance to surface or recharge his batteries, how he heard the calm, methodical ping of their sonars overhead. He writes, they were in no hurry. They were playing with us, like a cat with a mouse. We knew we were going to die. The only question was when they would decide to strike. There was no rage in their actions, only cold, almost soulless work, and that is more terrifying than any hatred. 2 days later, Klaus Schneider's submarine was sunk by a Hedgehog salvo from a British frigate. He would never know that his letter would only reach his wife after the war. This fanatical calm that Schneider wrote about became the Allies' main psychological weapon. They were no longer victims, desperately fighting off predators. They had become the sanitation crew of the ocean, coolly and methodically eradicating a disease. The Allied command understood this perfectly. Victory wasn't just about the tonnage of the enemy fleet sunk. It was about breaking the enemy's will, and they saw signs of it everywhere. German submariners surrendered more and more frequently. Japanese crews, known for their contempt for death, made navigational errors, exposing themselves to attack. Submarine officers, the elite of the Navy, heroes of the nation, now went into battle with a sense of doom. They used to be hunters, aces, masters of the deep. Now, they felt like expendable assets in a war their command had already lost. They were being sent to certain death, and they knew it. The Hedgehog and the system built around it destroyed not only hundreds of submarines, they destroyed the myth of their invincibility. And when the belief in victory dies, war turns into a senseless slaughter. May 1945. The guns in Europe fell silent. A few months later, the guns in the Pacific fell silent too. The world, wounded and devastated, breathed a sigh of relief. The war was won, but the hot war was almost immediately replaced by another, a cold one. An iron curtain descended across the continent, dividing yesterday's allies into two hostile camps. And the submarine threat did not disappear. It simply changed its flag. At the bottom of the Atlantic, in the hulls of sunken German U-boats, lay technological secrets that the Soviet Union was eager to obtain. The latest Type WWII boats, snorkels, acoustic torpedoes, all of this became the subject of intense study by Soviet engineers. Stalin ordered the creation of a powerful submarine fleet capable of challenging the West on its sea lanes. The arms race had not ended. It had entered a new phase. And in this new reality, the Hedgehog found a second life. From a weapon of victory, It became a weapon of deterrence, the shield of the free world. Imagine a naval parade in one of the countries of the newly formed NATO bloc. The 1950s, ships pass by the stands where admirals and politicians are gathered. British, French, Dutch, Canadian, American. The flags are different. The languages of command are different. But on the bows of many of them, like a family crest, rests the familiar silhouette of the Hedgehog. It is no longer just a weapon. It is a symbol of a unified defense doctrine, a symbol of the technological superiority that was meant to guarantee the security of sea lanes from the new threat from the east. The presence of this battle-proven system on board a ship became a marker of geopolitical alignment. It spoke without words. We are part of the Western world. We are ready to defend our common values. Dozens of countries received Hedgehogs through military aid programs, from South Korea to Brazil, from Greece to Australia. For the navies of smaller nations, this simple, reliable, and relatively inexpensive system became the only way to counter modern submarines. It remained in service for decades, outlasting its creators. And on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Soviet design bureaus worked tirelessly. Having studied captured samples and those supplied under Lend-Lease, they recognized the genius of the British concept. They recognized it and responded. Thus appeared the Soviet rocket-propelled depth charge launchers, the RBU. They also fired forward. They also covered an area. They were also integrated with sonar stations. The Soviet Union was forced to copy and develop this technology. It could not allow the West to dominate underwater. The Hedgehog had changed the rules of the game for good. It proved that the future of naval warfare lay in smart, systemic solutions. The era of giant battleships was a thing of the past. The era of quiet, intellectual, underwater struggle had begun. And the Hedgehog, born in the smoke of the Battle of the Atlantic, became the first word in this new, cold dialogue between the two superpowers. Hardware becomes obsolete. Ideas are immortal. Today, the Hedgehog projectors that survived the war are nothing more than museum exhibits, rusting relics from another era, gazed upon with curiosity by tourists. It seems their time has passed irrevocably. But this is just an illusion. The physical shell has died, but the spirit of the Hedgehog, its revolutionary DNA, lives on in every modern anti-submarine system. Because the Hedgehog was not just a weapon. It was a set of brilliant principles that forever changed the rules of undersea warfare. Principle 1. Strike forward. Never lose contact with the target. Principle 2. Precision is more important than power. One precise jab with a scalpel is more effective than 100 blows with a club. Principle 3. System integration. The weapon and the detection system must be a single entity, the brain and hand of one organism. These ideas, born in the smoke-filled offices of London, became a testament for future generations of engineers. The direct heirs to the Hedgehog were the British Squid and Limbo systems. They were bigger, more powerful, and smarter. They fired 300-kilogram projectiles, automatically set the detonation depth, and reloaded without human intervention. But at their core lay the very same principle, a forward strike, based on sonar data. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, Soviet designers created their own rocket-propelled depth charge launchers, the famous RBUs. Their appearance and caliber were different, but their tactical philosophy was a mirror image of the Hedgehog. And today, in the 21st century, the echo of the Hedgehog sounds louder than ever. Let's transport ourselves to the bridge of a modern anti-submarine frigate. There's no smell of salt water and damp wool here. There's the scent of ozone from the electronics and the quiet, focused hum of servers. The commander isn't looking through binoculars at the raging waves, but at a three-dimensional tactical map on a massive screen. Data from the most powerful sonar system, from a towed array, from a satellite. It all merges into a single picture of the battle. The sonar operator, a descendant of those guys who listened to the crackle in their headphones, calmly reports, "Target classified, motion parameters transferred to fire control system." The commander simply presses a single button on a touch panel. The ship shudders almost imperceptibly. From a forward launcher, leaving a fiery trail, a rocket-propelled depth charge launches. This is no longer a clumsy slug. This is a smart missile that flies forward, straight to the target. It guides itself in the final phase, correcting its course. It is a direct descendant of that very Hedgehog, only faster, smarter, and an order of magnitude deadlier. But its soul is the same. The story of the Hedgehog is not a story about hardware. It is a drama of how human genius, born of desperation, managed to turn the ocean from a deadly trap into a field of triumph. It is a story of how silence became the most terrifying weapon, and of how a few simple, revolutionary ideas, embodied in steel, forever changed the face of naval warfare. Night, the North Atlantic, 1942. On the bridge of the destroyer HMS Ontario, Lieutenant Commander James Evans listens to the monotonous pulse of war. Ping, ping, a sharp, clear signal. The sonar operator reports, "Contact, 200 yards, sir, passing underneath us." Inside the hull of the German submarine U-96, Kapitän Leutnant Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock smirks. He hears the same sound. He hears the destroyer's propellers overhead accelerating, turning into a furious roar. They've taken the bait. He's leading them straight to the prize target, a tanker in the heart of the convoy. For Evans, this is the moment of truth. Months of patrols, icy watches, the faces of sailors full of hope and fear. It all comes down to these few seconds. He gives the order. "Release!" A metallic clang. Heavy barrels drop from the stern. One, a second, a whole series. The ship shudders as, moments later, dull, crushing blows rise from the depths. The water astern boils, heaving up in giant white pillars. Evans and his crew stand frozen, staring into the black water, waiting for a sign, an oil slick, debris, anything. But the only response is silence, a deep, humiliating silence, broken only by the sound of the waves. The sonar operator shakes his head. "Contact lost, sir. Nothing." The entire munitions load dropped into nothing, into the ocean, and aboard U-96, the crew breathes a sigh of relief. The explosions were far off. They felt only a slight tremor in the hull. For them, it's a familiar sound, the music of their triumph. Captain Lehmann-Willenbrock gives a new order. "Torpedo tubes ready." An hour later, the radio operator on the bridge of the Ontario rips off his headphones. His face is a gray mask. "Sir, distress call from the tanker Amberlight. Torpedoed. She's on fire." This was the essence of the Battle of the Atlantic. Helplessness. The hunters were the hunted. Escort ships desperately lunged at shadows, dropping tons of explosives blindly. They could hear the enemy, but at the moment of attack, they became blind. The main tactical paradox was that the most accurate detection tool, the sonar, became completely useless at the most critical moment. Its beam, like a flashlight in the dark, couldn't see directly beneath the ship. To drop depth charges, the destroyer had to pass directly over the submarine. And in those final decisive meters, it lost contact. It was attacking a memory, a ghost. The probability of a hit, less than 7%. Out of 100 attacks, 93 ended in nothing, in a deafening void. 93 times, crews tore the ocean apart with tons of explosives, only to hear a new distress call over the radio. For the German submariners, Admiral Dönitz's aces, this was the happy time. They were the masters of the Atlantic. They called the destroyers tin drums, noisy, clumsy, and predictable. The Wolfpacks operated with surgical precision. At night, they would surface in the middle of a convoy and, like wolves in a flock of sheep, choose their victims. In 1942 alone, they sent over 1,100 ships to the bottom, 6 million tons of cargo, equipment, and human lives. For the sailors in the convoys, every night was a lottery of death. They would see a flash on the horizon, hear a roar, and pray it wasn't their ship. They looked at their escorts, at those desperate, furious, but almost useless attacks, and understood. They were alone in the freezing darkness. Their defenders were armed with hope and tons of steel that almost always missed. In this war, the roar of depth charges was not the sound of retribution. It was the sound of desperation. Victory is not born on the decks amid the roar of battle. It is born in silence, in smoke-filled rooms where desperation forces geniuses to break all the known rules. London, 1941. In the depths of the British Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a handful of engineers, whom naval officers contemptuously called the mad professors, were struggling with an unsolvable problem. A problem that was costing hundreds of lives every week. Again and again, they drew the same diagram on a blackboard, a destroyer passing over a submarine, and each time they ran up against the damned geometry of war. To kill, you must see. But the closer you get to the target, the blinder you become. The sonar, the ship's ears, went deaf at the last moment. It was an axiom of defeat. And then, in a cloud of tobacco smoke, a heretical thought was voiced. What if we stopped chasing its tail? What if we hit the enemy head on? What if we fire not backward, but forward? A new drawing appeared on the board, a strange, almost absurd contraption that looked like a multi-barreled church organ. 24 short rods, pointing at the sky. This was not an evolution of the depth charge. It was a revolution, born of hopelessness. The principle of the spigot mortar. The projectile wasn't pushed from within the barrel, but fitted over it, like a glove on a finger. A simple, even crude mechanism that allowed for a whole swarm of small bombs to be fired directly ahead of the ship. This solved the first problem, the blindness. Now the destroyer could attack without losing contact. It could look its victim in the eye until the very last moment. But the second idea was even more insane. The engineers proposed abandoning hydrostatic fuses, which detonated at a preset depth. Instead, contact fuses. Simply put, the bomb would only explode if it actually hit the submarine's hull. No more guesswork about its depth. No more area attacks. The strike had to be surgical. When the project was presented to the Admiralty, a silence fell over the room. The admirals, whose thinking had been forged by the thunder of cannonades, couldn't comprehend it. "What do you mean? There won't be an explosion if we miss?" one of them asked. To them, the roar of depth charges was a psychological weapon. It shook the enemy, demoralized them, even if it didn't kill them. The roar was proof of battle, proof of fury. And the engineers were proposing silence, a disconcerting, dead silence in case of a miss, and a single, short, devastating explosion in case of success. This shattered the very philosophy of naval warfare. It was an assault on its sacred rituals. At that very same time, in the headquarters of the commander of the German submarine force, Admiral Dönitz, confidence reigned. Analysts studied the reports. The Allies were in a panic. They were building more ships, but their tactics remained primitive. They were still trying to saturate the ocean with explosives, hoping for a miracle. They had no technological breakthrough. Time was on the side of the Wolfpacks. They didn't know that in foggy London, on a dusty chalkboard, the breakthrough had already occurred. The drawings from the fog were taking shape. This strange, quiet weapon, born not of strength but of weakness, was the answer no one expected. It had yet to receive its name, the Hedgehog, and it was preparing to change the rules of the game forever. The old methods were leading the Allies to defeat, and only madness could show them the way to victory. November 1st, 1943. The American destroyer USS Bory cuts through the icy waves of the Atlantic. On its bow, like some exotic plant, sits a new piece of hardware, the Hedgehog. The sailors eye it with barely hidden skepticism. They were used to roars and fury, used to war shaking the very foundations of the universe. But this contraption, it didn't roar. It hissed. The crews, retrained on the new system, were skeptical. The instructors in Key West preached to them about accuracy, about an intelligent hunt. But in the stormy Atlantic, when tons of water wash over the deck and the enemy could be anywhere, what they wanted was something simple and straightforward, a big bang. The Hedgehog didn't provide one. It was too quiet, too smart. On the Bory's bridge, Commander Charles Hutchins stares at the horizon. He is one of the few who believes in the new technology, but he also knows he has to prove its worth to his crew. And now, the moment has come. The sonar operator reports, his voice clear, without a hint of doubt. Contact, U-boat 405, range 250 yards. The ship turns to an attack course. Tension hangs in the air of the control room. This isn't the frenzied rush of a depth charge attack. This is the slow, calculated approach of a surgeon to their target. Hutchins gives quiet commands, turning the entire ship to aim the weapon. Finally, he says, "Fire." There is no deafening roar, just a short, angry hiss, as if a giant serpent had exhaled. 24 small bombs soar into the gray sky, tracing a graceful arc, and enter the water with barely audible splashes. And then, silence. A second, 5, 10, nothing. The sonar operator listens intently through his headphones, his face a stone mask. "Nothing, sir. She's still there. We missed." In the control room, someone mutters, quietly but clearly, "I told you this thing was useless." Hutchins feels a wave of disappointment and skepticism wash over his crew. They looked at him with silent reproach. All this newfangled tactic, all these blueprints and calculations, all for nothing. Give us back our good old ash cans. At least their roar scared the Jerrys. But this wasn't even funny. Deep underwater, in the hull of U-405, Oberleutnant Hermann Korrens also hears this silence. His sonarman had reported strange splashes, as if the destroyer had just dumped some trash overboard. Korrens is confident. They've lost him again. Now, while the Americans are turning for another pointless depth charge run, he has precious minutes. He prepares to counterattack. And so, a nickname was born. The sailors dubbed the Hedgehog Hope and Pray. Because after its hissing salvo, there was nothing left but to hope for a hit and pray the enemy wouldn't strike first. The absence of an explosion wasn't just a sign of a miss. It was a psychological blow to their own side. It sowed doubt, rage, a feeling of their own powerlessness. The weapon that was meant to be a revolution at first seemed like a pathetic, toothless rattle, and every quiet miss only strengthened the German submariners' conviction. They were still the masters of the Atlantic. November 1942. The Mediterranean Sea. A cold, moonless night. The British corvette HMS Lotus has been engaged in a grueling cat-and-mouse game with a German U-boat for hours. Again and again, its commander, Lieutenant Commander Henry Jacob, brings his small ship into position for a Hedgehog attack. And again, silence after the salvo. The crew is exhausted. The paint on the bridge's bulkheads was cracked from the tension. Every miss is another chance for the enemy to escape or strike back. Jacob looks at the faces of his men. He sees fatigue and disbelief in their eyes. He's at his limit too. The old methods, the good old depth charges, now seem like such a simple, clear solution. Drop them, stun them, make the enemy nervous. But orders were orders. The Admiralty demanded they use the new weapon to gather statistics. One more run. Jacob's voice sounds hollow. Sonar, give me a precise bearing. The Lotus turns slowly. The propellers barely spin, so as not to spook the target. Finally, the ship steadies on its course. The command is given again. Again, the short hiss of 24 spigots launching their deadly payload. The projectiles vanish into the darkness. And again, silence falls. Thick, viscous, like tar. The sailors on the bridge don't look at each other. All eyes are on the sonar operator, who, with headphones pressed to his ears, has become a living seismograph. 5 seconds. 10. An eternity seems to pass. It's another failure. The commander is about to give the order to reload, when suddenly, 15 seconds after the salvo, the silence is shattered by a deep, crushing underwater impact. It's nothing like the rolling thunder of a depth charge. It's a short, monstrously powerful jolt, as if a giant fist had slammed the ocean floor. The hull of the Lotus vibrates like a string. Glasses in the wardroom fall from their shelves. One of the sailors on deck cries out in surprise. The sonar operator rips off his headphones. His eyes are wide. He shouts, his voice a mixture of shock and elation. We have it. An explosion. Contact. The contact is breaking up. I can hear the hull cracking. A stunned silence falls over the bridge for a second. One explosion? And that's it? They're sunk? It can't be. The sailors, accustomed to the fiery symphonies of war, can't believe a battle could end so prosaically, so quietly. But the evidence was undeniable. The sonar picked up nothing but the fading echo of metal's death throes. U-boat U-224, a mortal threat just moments before, had ceased to exist. It was simply switched off. At that moment, the true, revolutionary nature of the new weapon began to dawn on the crew of the Lotus, and soon, on the entire fleet. Silence wasn't a sign of failure. Silence was the norm. But an explosion meant a 100% hit, a guaranteed kill. No more doubts, no more oil slicks that could be a decoy, no more debris released to deceive them. If the Hedgehog spoke, the enemy was dead. Meanwhile, at Admiral Dönitz's headquarters, they were analyzing their losses. U-224 destroyed under strange circumstances. Its last message, under attack. No data about a series of depth charge explosions, which everyone was used to. Something new. Something incomprehensible. Something quiet and deadly had appeared in the Allies' arsenal. And that single deep explosion in the midst of dead silence was the first death knell for the happy time of the German submariners. The explosion that destroyed U-224 was more than just a successful shot. It was a revelation. Escort group commanders began to understand. They had been given not a club, but a scalpel. The Hedgehog wasn't a weapon of brute force, designed to plow through acres of ocean. It demanded a different approach, a different mindset. It demanded one become a predator, not just a watchdog. The art of this new hunt was perfected by one man, Captain Frederick John Walker, a legend of anti-submarine warfare, commander of the 2nd Escort Group. His face, weathered by Atlantic storms, seemed carved from granite. But behind this harsh exterior was a cold, calculating, and brilliant tactical mind. Walker understood the most important thing. The Hedgehog's strength was its surprise, and surprise required silence. Thus, the creeping attack tactic was born. This was no longer a duel. It was an execution. Imagine the bridge of Walker's flagship, the sloop HMS Starling, in 1943. The sonar operator reports a contact, but Walker doesn't rush to attack. He doesn't increase speed, giving himself away with the noise of his propellers. Instead, he passes the target's precise coordinates to another ship in his group, the destroyer HMS Wild Goose. A deadly ballet begins aboard the Wild Goose. The commander gives orders in almost a whisper. The engine room receives the command, dead slow. The ship begins to move barely faster than a walking pace, gliding almost silently through the waves. The tension on its bridge is so thick you could cut it with a knife. There are no shouts of "full ahead," only quiet, clipped phrases: bearing, range, depth. The sonar operator has become the commander's eyes and ears. His voice, amplified by the intercom, is the only sound that matters. He is guiding the massive steel ship through the water like a guide leading the blind. On his flagship, Walker watches the maneuver. He is the conductor of this deadly orchestra. He keeps the U-boat on a leash with his powerful sonar, preventing it from escaping, but not scaring it with active measures. He simply waits. And deep underwater, in the steel belly of the German submarine, a deceptive calm prevails. The crew hears a distant, indistinct sonar ping. They know the escort is somewhere nearby, but it's far off. It has lost them. They can catch their breath. They can have a cup of hot coffee. The commander is confident. A few more minutes, and they'll break away for good. He doesn't know that a killer is creeping up on him, making almost no sound. On the bridge of the Wild Goose, the commander raises his hand. Fire. A short hiss, and silence again. But now, it is not the silence of doubt. It is the silence of a verdict being awaited. For the crew of the German U-boat, the first sound of danger isn't even a sound. It's a strange, barely perceptible tapping on the hull, as if someone threw a handful of gravel, as if it had started to rain. Underwater. It's the 24 Hedgehog projectiles entering the water directly above them. And a second later, a blinding flash, a monstrous impact, and darkness. They never knew what killed them. Captain Walker lowers his binoculars. There isn't a shadow of triumph on his face, only the satisfaction of a job well done. Quieter, he would tell his officers. No unnecessary noise. We approach her like a wolf stalking a sheep. This tactic turned his 2nd Escort Group into the most effective team of U-boat killers in the entire war. They were no longer convoy defenders. They became hunters. The Hedgehog and Walker's tactics changed the psychology of the war. They taught sailors to kill quietly, with calculation, and without mercy. And for Admiral Dönitz's Wolfpacks, the Atlantic was rapidly turning from a hunting ground into a vast underwater cemetery. The new weapon gave the hunters a scalpel, but even the sharpest scalpel in a surgeon's hands can sometimes only wound the beast, making it twice as dangerous. Destroyer crews quickly realized the Hedgehog's main, fatal flaw, its all-or-nothing principle. A depth charge, even if it exploded tens of meters from the target, still inflicted damage. Its shock wave was like the blow of a giant hammer. It tore off rivets, shattered instruments, disabled depth rudders, and extinguished the lights. It demoralized the crew, turning the submarine's steel cigar into a rattling, leaking trap. A near miss with a depth charge was still a hit. A near miss with the Hedgehog was nothing. An absolute, humiliating void. 24 projectiles simply sank into the ocean. The submarine didn't get a single scratch. This price of failure became fully clear on November 1st, 1943, in the very battle where the destroyer Bory first used its Hedgehog against U-405. After the first, unsuccessful salvo, Commander Charles Hutchins understood there might not be a second chance. He brought the ship into position again. Again the command. Again the hissing sound. This time, a muffled explosion tore through the silence. 1, maybe 2. Cheers erupted on the bridge. A hit. But U-405 didn't break apart. The Hedgehog had dealt it a terrible wound, but not a fatal one. The projectiles had pierced the pressure hull. Water flooded the compartments. Oberleutnant Correns gave the only possible order: blow all tanks, surface, to the surface. For the crew of the Bory, what happened next came as a shock. From the depths, like a monstrous whale, spewing streams of compressed air and water, their victim burst to the surface. The wounded beast refused to die in the dark. It broke through to the light to fight its final battle. All hell broke loose. The two vessels, separated by just 100 meters of churning water, opened up a hurricane of fire on each other with everything that could shoot: cannons, machine guns, rifles. This was no longer a modern war of technology. This was a primal, furious brawl, like a boarding action from the age of pirates. The German submariners, having scrambled onto the deck, showered the destroyer with lead. The American sailors returned fire in kind. Hutchins understood. The submarine, even damaged, could still escape, disappearing into the night. And he made a desperate decision. Ram her! The Bory, at full speed, smashed into the submarine's hull. There was a monstrous screech of tearing metal. The ships were locked in a deadly embrace. For a moment, they became one, a monument to mutual hatred. Sailors leaped from one ship to the other, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Knives, wrenches, and helmets were put to use. The Hedgehog started this fight, but it couldn't finish it cleanly. Its surgical precision had turned into a bloody slaughter. It delivered a blow that should have been fatal, but it only triggered the most ferocious death throes. In the end, both ships went to the bottom. The Bory sustained fatal wounds from the ramming and was abandoned by its crew. U-405 sank almost immediately. The Allies had won, but the price of this victory was extremely high: the loss of their own ship. This battle was a harsh lesson. The Hedgehog was a weapon of absolute triumph or total failure. It did not forgive mistakes and left no room for half measures. It could deliver a clean, quiet victory. Or, in the case of the slightest miscalculation, it could unleash a slaughter with no rules, from which even the victors might not return. Every commander who gave the order fire now knew he was betting everything, with nothing held back. The new scalpel of war, honed in the Atlantic, encountered an enemy that engineers in their warm London offices could not have foreseen. That enemy was the Arctic itself, a merciless, icy element that waged its own war, with no regard for flags or orders. The winter of 1943, the route of the Arctic convoys to Murmansk. For the sailors, it was a path to hell. Air temperature, -20 degrees. Water temperature, around 0. The wind, roaring at 100 kilometers per hour, raised waves as high as a 3-story building. But the main enemy wasn't the storm, it was the ice. Sea spray, hitting the metal, froze instantly. The ships sailing to the Soviet Union were turning into ice sculptures before their very eyes. Antennas, railings, gun barrels, everything was coated in a thick, heavy shell. And the Hedgehog, mounted in the most exposed place, on the forecastle, suffered the most. Imagine a watchman on the destroyer HMS Meteor. His name is John. He's 19. He's from Liverpool. Right now, he's standing on an ice-covered deck, and his world has narrowed to two things: the roar of the storm and the fight for his life. A gigantic gray wave crashes over the bow. The water is as cold as liquid nitrogen. It knocks him off his feet, tries to drag him overboard into the black, boiling abyss. John clings to an icy railing, his fingers in their soaked gloves no longer feeling the metal. His job, and the job of a dozen other guys just like him, is to clear the ice from the Hedgehog. Their weapons are heavy hammers, crowbars, and axes. They strike the mount, chipping away the thick crust that has frozen the spigots and projectiles. Every piece of ice that breaks off is a small step toward survival. Because everyone on the ship knows, it's in this kind of weather that the Wolfpacks love to hunt. For the German submariners, the storm was their best ally. In the roar of the waves, Allied sonar became almost useless, and the deck armaments, they rightly assumed, were likely frozen solid. These were perfect conditions for an attack. They could get almost point blank without being noticed. That's why John and his comrades are waging their desperate battle against the elements. Their work is a race against time. The cold cramps their hands. Their faces have turned into masks of ice. Their eyelashes are frozen together. Every 15 to 20 minutes, an officer herds them inside to warm up, to keep them from freezing to death. But then they go back out onto the deck, into that roaring hell. They know that if the sonar operator now screams, "Contact," and the Hedgehog is encased in ice, they are all doomed. Their entire convoy, these precious transports with tanks, planes, and food for the Eastern Front, will become icy mass graves. Their only chance of survival is the small, temperamental weapon system on the bow, which they must constantly warm with their own breath and break free from its icy prison. In this war, there were no heroic attacks or glorious victories. Heroism was found in the monotonous, grueling, and deadly dangerous work, in the fight not against German aces, but against nature itself. And every Hedgehog spigot cleared of ice was no less a victory than a sunken submarine. It was a victory of perseverance over despair, a victory of warm human blood over the icy breath of the Arctic. Victory is never final. It only opens a new chapter in the endless arms race. At Admiral Dönitz's headquarters, they were no longer laughing at the Allies' quiet weapon. Analysts had gathered enough data to understand they were facing a systemic threat. The Hedgehog was no longer a strange experiment. It had become a lethal reality that was changing the balance of power in the Atlantic. And Germany responded. The response was asymmetrical and ingenious. German engineers struck at the Allies' two main vulnerabilities. First, the hunters needed to find their prey. But what if the prey learned to hold its breath? This led to the snorkel, a simple device, at first glance, a retractable tube for air intake and exhaust fumes. But it revolutionized warfare. Now a submarine could run on its diesel engines while submerged. It no longer needed to surface to recharge its batteries, risking detection by radar. It could remain in the shadows for weeks, becoming an almost invisible ghost. The ocean became opaque again. The hunt became an order of magnitude more difficult. The second response was even more deadly. German engineers analyzed the creeping attack tactic and understood its essence. At low speed, a destroyer was almost silent. But what if you could force it to make noise? Thus was born the G7E's acoustic homing torpedo, known as the Zaunkönig, or Gnat. The Allies nicknamed it the Gnome. This torpedo was a predator. It had ears. It didn't travel in a straight line. It listened, and it headed for the loudest sound, the noise of the attacking destroyer's propellers. The Battle of the Atlantic turned into a deadly chess match, a race of minds. 1944. The bridge of the escort destroyer HMS Atherstone. The commander, Lieutenant David Jenkins, is leading his ship as part of a hunter-killer group. They have been pursuing a contact for hours. It's a new, elusive German Type 7C U-boat with a snorkel. She is barely visible on sonar. She is slow, quiet, like a fish. Finally, Jenkins thinks he has her cornered. He gives the order to close in for a Hedgehog attack. And at that moment, the sonar operator screams into the speaking tube. His voice is cracking with tension. "Strange noise, sir. High frequency. Sounds like a torpedo. It's coming right at us." The hunter himself became the hunted. Jenkins reacts instantly. "Hard to starboard. Full speed ahead. Deploy the noisemaker." A Foxer flies into the water from the ship's stern, a special device that, when towed, creates a noise several times louder than the propellers. It's a decoy, a false target for the Predator torpedo. The destroyer banks into a desperate turn. On the bridge, everyone freezes, listening. Will they get past? Or will an explosion tear their ship in half at any moment? A few seconds later, a dull thud is heard far astern. The Foxer worked. The torpedo found it, not them. Jenkins wipes the sweat from his brow. They survived. But he understands. The rules have changed again. Now, every attack is a mortal risk. German engineers had thrown down the gauntlet. They said, "Your Hedgehog hits a nearly stationary target, but our torpedo will find your noisy destroyer on its own. Let's see who outsmarts whom." The advantage the Hedgehog provided was no longer absolute. It had become temporary. Each side learned new tricks, new deceptions. The Allies developed more advanced sonars to hear the quiet, snorkel-equipped U-boats. The Germans improved their torpedoes so they could distinguish a ship's noise from a decoy's. It was a war of engineers, tacticians, and acousticians. A war won not by the strongest, but by the fastest, the most precise, and the most cunning. The Atlantic had become a giant chessboard, where the price of a mistake in this intellectual duel was instant and brutal death. The technology born in foggy London out of desperation found its true power across the ocean, in the roar of American shipyards. If Britain gave the Hedgehog its soul, the brilliant idea, then America gave it a body, a huge, indestructible, steel body. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the sleeping giant of American industry awoke, and it awoke in a fury. President Roosevelt demanded a miracle from the nation to turn the country into the arsenal of democracy. And the miracle happened. Shipyards that had been building civilian vessels just yesterday switched to a war footing. Entire cities sprang up around new factories. Smoke from thousands of chimneys blotted out the sun. America began to forge victory. The Hedgehog blueprints, transferred under the Lend-Lease program, fell on fertile ground. The Americans didn't invent anything new. They took the British concept and did what they did best. They put it on an assembly line. Picture the Consolidated Steel Corporation shipyard in California. The year is 1943. They don't build ships here. They assemble them, like cars in a Ford factory. Dozens of destroyer escort hulls stand in the docks at various stages of completion. The noise is unimaginable. The screech of metal, the roar of pneumatic hammers, the shouts of foremen. Thousands of workers, men and women, work in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. And above it all, like giant birds of prey, glide the port cranes. One of them gently lifts a familiar structure into the air, a Hedgehog launcher, fresh off the production line. It carries it to a nearly finished destroyer hull with the designation DE-501 and carefully lowers it onto its prepared place on the foredeck. Welders immediately surround it, and a shower of sparks welds the new weapon to the ship. And right next to it, the next one is already waiting its turn, and the next. These were no longer isolated experiments. This was a flood, an assembly line of victory. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry produced about 3,300 Hedgehog launchers, millions of projectiles for them. But most importantly, it launched hundreds of ships capable of carrying this weapon. Edsall and Captain-class destroyer escorts, River-class frigates, they came off the slipways at an incredible speed. Sometimes, less than a month passed from laying the keel to launching. For Admiral Dönitz, this became a waking nightmare. His U-boat aces could sink 1 destroyer. They could sink 5, but they couldn't sink the American shipyards. In his memoirs, he wrote with bitterness, "Their numbers are growing exponentially. Even with our successes, we are sinking them slower than they can build them. Time is starting to work against us." The American command, initially skeptical of the British toy, now placed its main bet on it. An order from Admiral King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, stated clearly, "Every destroyer, every frigate involved in convoy escort must receive its Hedgehog." America's steel fist was closing. The quiet, intelligent idea of British engineers, multiplied by the boundless power of American industry, had turned into an unstoppable force. Hundreds of hunter ships prepared to set out into the ocean. They carried on their bows a weapon that was meant to turn the Atlantic into a giant, deadly trap for German submarines. The battle of wits continued, but now the Allies had a new, crushing argument, an endless stream of steel. The story of the Hedgehog is not a tale about iron. It's a parable of how cold calculation defeated desperate valor, and how silence became more terrifying than the most deafening explosion. It's about how a genius born of powerlessness created not just a weapon, but a new philosophy of war, where victory belongs not to the one who shouts the loudest, but to the one who thinks most precisely. But what happens to the spirit of a warrior when his courage and experience are rendered powerless by the soulless mathematics of the enemy? And isn't this the main lesson of this story? That the most perfect weapon is the one that breaks not steel, but will. This silence, created by the Hedgehog, still echoes in the corridors of military history, asking uncomfortable questions. Share your thoughts on this in the comments. If you, like us, value stories like these, where the drama of the human spirit is visible behind the technology, subscribe to the channel and support this film with a like. It helps us continue our dialogue with the past.